عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وبعد. Inshallah, today, this second session on Protips for learning Arabic, we'll be discussing another book, another resource that you can use to help you in the process of building vocabulary. Once again, this particular resource is something that perhaps will be useful after you've already gone through the process of maybe studying an introductory textbook that helps you learn Arabic um, as a foreign language, learning Arabic as a second tongue. So this is the text we're going to be taking a look at. This is the Concise Arabic English Lexicon of Verbs in Context. Some of you might be aware, the previous book that I'd shared, I did encourage everyone to actually buy it, but it seems that it's out of print. It is, the Arabic is the Easy Dictionary of Quran. It is out of print, but it's readily available as a PDF. This book is also a book that if you search for it, you will find it PDF. And some of the links that we posted on the various channels for the Legacy Institute, we posted a link for the PDF of this book. I don't know if it's in the description of the video. If it's not, we will add it. But this book, I did check, it's available on Amazon and some other places. So again, I would encourage you to actually buy the book and not simply suffice with PDF. So this is the book. This is the cover. Concise Arabic English Lexicon of Verbs in Context by Ahmed Tahir Hassanain and others. We'll just briefly take a look at the introduction and then maybe just a sample from the book so you can get an idea of how to best make use of the book. The teaching of Arabic traditionally focuses on one of the most remarkable features of the Arabic language, words derived from a single root that is usually composed of three radicals or three letters. At this point, you're probably all aware that the bulk of words in the Arabic language come from three-letter roots, and the Arabic language is very versatile in its ability to derive many different words from a single root. And so you'll have various nouns, adjectives, verbs, all coming from a single root. And the ability of Arabic to take that single root and spread it across many different sarf patterns, morphological patterns, gives the Arabic language a remarkable versatility in its ability to create vocabulary and to create new terms when the need so arises. And many of these patterns also, the pattern will indicate some meaning that is present along with the meaning that is present in the root. Again, this is something we're not going to get into. It's probably something you will come across at some point in your studies if you haven't already. But because of this, the root system is very essential in the Arabic language. And you will find that most Arabic dictionaries, particularly the original Arabic dictionaries, maybe not all of the Arabic English dictionaries you find, also some of the modern dictionaries that have been written. But for the most part, the classical dictionaries entries are arranged according to the root. So to be able to find an entry, you will need to know its root letters. And so this is a very central feature of the Arabic language. And anyways, continuing the same introduction, with the most basic set of verbs, those known as form 1. This is basically verbs that are fa'ala, from the fa'ala pattern, as opposed to fa'ala and af'ala and istaf'ala and so forth. These are various patterns. In English, they typically refer to them as form 1, form 2, all the way through form 10. These are the different forms that a verb can take, all coming from a single root. So with the most basic set of verbs, those known as form one, the three radicals, meaning the three root letters, alone are the written form of the past tense of a verb, and often it's verbal noun or the masdar. Because this form one verb can then be modified by prefixes, insertions, and doubled middle radicals to create other verbs, those are forms 2 through 10, the regularity of these patterns has led to the conventional wisdom that once a root meaning is known, it is not difficult in some cases to infer the meanings or connotations of other verbs created from the same root. They've made a note here that they've also included four root verbs. There are in this dictionary some four root verbs. As authors, we've also included some quadrilateral verbs that are widely used in modern standard Arabic because one of the purposes of this dictionary was to make easy the learning of Arabic for students, to facilitate their learning and increasing their vocabulary. So they've included a number of, and again, their focus is on modern standard Arabic or contemporary Arabic, contemporary formal Arabic that is used. Four radical verbs are represented by Q1, and Q2. Not going to really explain that too much. The Concise Arabic English Lexicon of Verbs and Context first took shape as a list compiled primarily to help Arabic language students at the American University in Cairo overcome the problems they encountered using traditional Arabic dictionaries. Unlike such dictionaries, which commonly display verbs forms haphazardly, this lexicon arranges them into the 10 verb forms that are commonly adopted by institutions that teach Arabic as a foreign language. Our teaching experience, so for many of you, this will be useful because you might very well have learned the verb forms in this fashion. Our teaching experience had shown us that these difficulties, common to learners of Arabic as a second language, as well as native speakers, would be lessened if they had a collection of verbs ordered in the conventional system with each of the three essential units, past tense, present tense, and verbal nouns, fully vocalized for every single word written. Since our goal was to ease the learning process while promoting comprehension of present-day usage, the list naturally omits unusual or disused words. So there's going to be a sort of a bias or slant in this dictionary more towards contemporary usage, as a result of which this might not be quite ideal for those who are studying primarily with an eye towards classical Arabic in particular, but that doesn't mean that you cannot benefit from this dictionary. This lexicon also avoids propagating the misleading assumption that the meanings of the verbs derived from one three radical root are all logical extensions of the meaning of the form one root. Suffice it to say that the relationship between a root and the words that are derived from it is not always quite so straightforward. It can be a little bit complicated. So there is some need of explanation. Sometimes you can, just from your knowledge of the forms and the patterns, if you know the meaning of the primary root or the primary verb that comes from that root, you can figure out the meanings of the rest of the verbs or many of them. But that's not always the case. And so for that reason, they've made this dictionary and they've attempted to give you a brief English definition of each of the verbs. So originally they were planning on doing a short glossary of terms, samples. This evolved into a fairly large lexicon, a word list distinguished not only by fully vocalized presentation of past and present tenses and verbal nouns of every root, but also by fully vocalized sentences, providing a context that encourages students to discern meaning by reading Arabic with the assistance of brief English definitions. Something you might recall from previous discussions. One way that you want to get to the point where you are able to learn Arabic by, and that would go for any language, but obviously we're talking about learning Arabic, that you're able to learn and acquire vocabulary and understand the meaning of vocabulary from seeing it used in context. And that this is the way that the bulk of learning takes place. Even with your own native language, this is how you learn. So this dictionary then is an excellent tool for helping to bridge that gap that we spoke about. That there's oftentimes a significant vocabulary gap that learners have when they're trying to go from the stage of studying a textbook, whatever that basic textbook may be, whether it's a Western textbook or an Eastern one like Al-Arabiya Bayna Yadayk. You by the time you get done with that textbook or set of textbooks, you have a certain amount of vocabulary, but again, it's not enough that you can simply start reading whatever you want. You might still find that there's significant gaps in your vocabulary that you struggle with, and that struggle can create frustration as you start trying to be an independent reader. And so you need certain resources, certain methods to help you bridge that gap, in your vocabulary. And to get you from the point of having studied a textbook, having learned the basics, to being at the point where you can start reading independent. You have enough of a vocabulary base that you can read independently. You can read text for yourself and figure out what they mean without having the need for a teacher or a translation or what have you. That requires a certain amount of vocabulary. This is one of the resources that you can do for helping to build this is one of the resources you can use for helping to build your vocabulary base. And one of the things that's nice about this is that the way that this dictionary is arranged, it is arranged such that you have sample sentences for every entry. At least one sample sentence for each verb form, sometimes two sample sentences. And since there's a brief explanation of the meaning of the word for that entry, it helps you to read and understand the meaning of the word and seeing it used in context, in a sort of a natural context where you might expect it to be found in a typical Arabic sentence. And so this is then going to be a useful tool to help you build your knowledge of the vocabulary, as well as going through sample Arabic texts that will help you expand your familiarity with the language. The brevity of these English definitions is one of the two features that have led us to call this lexicon concise. So it's not too detailed in terms of its defining the terms. By reducing, and in this respect, you will find it is similar to what we saw with the Easy Dictionary on. By reducing the English to the fewest words possible, the attention of students is to be focused not on English but on the Arabic usage and its context. And this is a good point, that focusing on the Arabic usage and trying to understand the verb from looking at it being used in context will enrich your understanding of the vocabulary that you are acquiring. The second concise feature is in the number of verbs included. Although there are about 5,000 verbs derived from more than 2,000 roots, we have limited the collection to those we consider most essential to reading and speaking modern Arabic today. So this is then, going through this dictionary is going to help you. This is a pretty big vocabulary list, 5,000 Arabic verbs. That's a lot of vocabulary, and each one with one or two sample sentences constructed by the authors of this dictionary that will allow you to see those verbs being used in context, really helping to drive home the meaning of those verbs. And so, if you go through this dictionary, and again, they've attempted to choose not to make a comprehensive dictionary covering all the verb forms that are used, but the ones that are going to be most essential to reading and speaking modern standard Arabic today. So in other words, this is going to give you a very good base for your reading. Again, the slant is towards modern Arabic. Some verbs might be used sometimes for meanings that are different from how they were used in classical Arabic, particularly in the early centuries, and generally in scholarly texts and things like that you might be interested in reading. You might find occasionally that there's some difference, but the difference is not going to be so radical that this is not useful to you. And at the same time, if you're reading Arabic, you'll probably at some point want to be able to read works by contemporary scholars, or depending on what your reasons for learning Arabic are, maybe not even scholarly works, just general reading. And so obviously this will be useful. A selection that also serves to reinforce the vocabulary of the widely used modern standard Arabic textbooks and the like. Thus, our lexicon is a basic reference tool for beginner, intermediate, and advanced students as they develop a sound working vocabulary in modern standard Arabic. While the students will supplement it with a wider range of resources as their language skills improve, the regular use of the lexicon will strengthen their vocabulary and the early reading skills they require to progress in their study. Just skip this. Context sentences. Relying upon the student's knowledge of English is an important feature in the most effective use of this lexicon. But the crucial step is the student's use of the Arabic sentence to grasp meaning within a context. At first, students will need to remember the short English term, but as they reread the Arabic, they will find that the sentences alone can provide the essential meaning. And this is an important point. This is what we're striving for, that ideally you want to get to a point where new vocabulary that you're learning it simply from seeing it used in context. Because there's only so many words at the end of the day that you're going to look up in a dictionary. I mean, as a native English speaker, even if you're somebody who uses a dictionary a lot, probably less than 1% of the vocabulary you have you actually learned from a dictionary. You learned it from going to school, you learned it from reading, you learned it from listening to the radio. Okay, well, people listen to the radio, but you learned it from watching TV, etc., etc. You learned it in context, and from seeing it used in context, you gain a better understanding of the word and how it's intended to be used, and so forth. So this is a natural part of learning any language. You want to be able to get to that point. Now, learning a foreign language, obviously, because there's a significant gap in terms of your experience with the language, your immersion in the language, the amount of time spent learning the language. I mean, you could, if someone who's a native speaker of the language, they start off, as children, being exposed to that language, using it on a very basic level, and being able to grow their knowledge of the language slowly and gradually in a natural fashion. You want to sort of cram all of that experience into a very short amount of time, because you probably don't want to spend 20 years just to get to the point where you have a good command of the language, if that is your goal, to have a good command of the language. So naturally then, as a learner, you're probably going to have to use a dictionary a lot more than the native speaker ever does. But with that said, you cannot expect that all the vocabulary that you need to learn, you're simply going to learn by every time you're reading a text and you come across a word that you don't know, you look it up in the dictionary. Because you'll never finish anything. You get frustrated and you'll quit. Yes, there's a thing here. At first, students will need to remember the short English term, but as they reread the Arabic, they will find that the sentences alone can provide the essential meaning. Just as they learn new words in English by using words in context, so they will be able to use the Arabic sentence and its variations to learn in Arabic the meaning of new Arabic words. The English definition is a temporary crutch, but the Arabic sentence can be a major step toward developing the ability to learn Arabic in an Arabic context, especially that it carries a heavy load of cultural components. Okay, this is explaining the different forms. And then there is a version of this introduction in Arabic, and then you come to the entries. So I'm just going to skip to someplace in the book at random. So you have, for example, صار يسير سيرورة. لقد صار الآن أكبر رجل أعمال لديه شركات ومؤسسات ومشروعات لا حصر لها. So that wasn't a very good example, but ideally you want to practice when you're learning the vocabulary from this work or works like this. One thing that you can do that will help you a lot is practice saying it, practice vocalizing it out loud. So in this particular case, which is not ideal, but in this particular case, you might have noted that I stumbled in reading a number of the words, although that's because I was actually distracted because I'm looking at two different screens and trying to keep track of what's going on. But it, again, that's natural. You're learning a new language. Some expressions you might find sort of almost a tongue twister. You've struggled to get it out, struggled to pronounce it naturally. You're simply struggling with the language. So one thing that you want to do, and this is good for this purpose as well, is simply vocalize, practice vocalizing texts. So here, we have at the level of complete sentences, and that's good because ideally, you want to be able to speak in full sentences if you're going to be speaking. And so one way to gain the ability to speak is to simply take these sorts of resources, like with this dictionary, read the sentences. As you're studying the vocabulary, read the sentences. Read the sentences, try and understand the sentence, try and understand the meaning of the word that you're looking at from its context, and then practice saying it. Practice saying it until you can say it without stumbling. Practice saying it until you can say it like a native speaker, someone who has a command of the language. And then repeat it a few times once you're comfortable saying it. Once you get the hang of saying it properly, repeat it a few times so that you become comfortable. And so you will find very quickly that if you do that, and you're doing that every day, even if you're just spending, say, just 10 minutes every day, where you're reading some texts, repeating them until you're able to read them fluently, read them fluidly, read them comfortably, you'll find that that helps tremendously in getting your tongue accustomed to enunciating, getting your tongue accustomed to producing large blocks of language, as opposed to pronouncing individual words. Obviously, if you're struggling pronouncing an individual word, you might have to practice that word. But then you want to practice using that word in a sentence, because if the word by itself is tripping you up, you might repeat it until you're able to say it. But then when you try and use it in a sentence, it might still trip you up. And so by this process of repetition, you will allow you to practice using the language, being able to pronounce it comfortably. The other thing that you will get from this is that if you're understanding the sentence and you're starting to and the verbs are starting to make sense to you from their context, if they're starting to make sense to you from their context, then you will start gradually, from reading the sentences, maybe even, I guess, you might repeat some of them so many times that you practically memorize. But again, the goal is not to memorize this dictionary, but to get the command of the language. And so part of that will be for the basic sentence structures, the way in which you're going to express yourself using the language, for that to become second nature to you. So the more text, the more sentences that you have to sample, doing that with, the more practice you're getting. Eventually what will happen is, like the child who is learning the language for the first time from his parents, and he gradually starts being able to phrase things, and then he from enough repetition starts to internalize the sentence patterns, and then starts constructing sentences of his own with the vocabulary that he knows. The same thing will happen for you as an adult learner of a foreign language, that eventually from the repetition, the patterns that you see that for the construction of sentences in the Arabic language will start becoming instinctive. They'll start becoming automatic to you, And so when you want to produce a sentence, you'll be able to do it, assuming that you have the vocabulary necessary to produce the sentence that you want. You'll eventually be able to do it. And so this sort of practice is a good step towards developing the ability to speak, developing speaking ability. So in any case, okay, ضبط يضبط ضبطا. You'll note that typically in an Arabic dictionary they would have, this would be mansub, but here this is the verbal noun form. Here it's not. So here they use ضبط with the meaning of arrest. ضبطه الضابط, the officer arrested him, ووجد معه المسروقات, and found with him the stolen goods. انضبط ينضبط انضباطا, to be regulated. انضبط الشارع الآن بعد دوريات الشرطة المتواصلة. So now the street, meaning the traffic on the street, is regulated. Everyone is following the rules after the regular, the continuous, I'm not sure how it translates, دوريات الشرطة. Basically, the idea is the regular patrols, regular police patrols have caused the traffic to become regulated. So as you read these sentences and try and figure out what is being said here, and again, obviously, this is not going to be something that is all that useful necessarily for someone who has no background, is absolute beginner. But if you've already gone to a certain point in your studies where you have a little bit of vocabulary, basic foundation in vocabulary, you'll be able to figure a lot of things out just from the context. So a shari', probably, a lot of you will have learned the word shari'. You'll know that shari' means street. And ضبط, as explained here, as to be regulated. Al-an, you would know. Ashurta, you would know. Mutawasila, I think you would probably know. Doriyat would maybe be an odd word for you, but you could probably get an idea of the idea of a police patrol just from the context. And so that's an example of how context allows you to learn, pick up vocabulary. Context will help you picking up vocabulary. So this is one resource that you can use, something that can help you build your vocabulary. It's something that can help you bridge the gap between studying a textbook to having enough of a vocabulary base for reading independently. In this case, particularly for modern standard Arabic, obviously they've particularly chosen the verbs in this selection, in this collection, for the purpose of covering the verbs that would be most essential and most useful for reading modern standard Arabic texts. So this will help you build your reading ability, and finally practicing the vocalization. And of course, one thing that can help you with the practicing of vocalization that I highly recommend is when you're still in the early stages of your Arabic studies, I would recommend, and if you haven't done this yet, then it's never too late to start, study Tajweed, because Tajweed will help you learn the proper pronunciation. It will help you learn the proper pronunciation of the letters. Practicing your Tajweed will help you get a hang of the sound of the language. And this is important because one thing you have to remember is that while we're obviously, all of us are now, literate, we read and we write, but at its root, language is an oral production. It is something that we consume primarily by way of hearing. And so even when we read and we write, what we're reading and writing are in fact, basically, what is writing? Writing is symbols that symbolize the sound. And so the way that our brain processes the language is by the sound of the words. And so someone who doesn't have a command of the sound can easily mix up words. And so you want to get um, comfortable pronouncing the words correctly, and um, you want to get comfortable pronouncing the words correctly, and studying Tajweed will help you do that, and it will also help you actually learn the words and understand the words, because your retention will be better because you actually know the words, and you actually know how they're pronounced, and you recognize them when you hear them, and so forth. So all of that will also help in your understanding. It's not just in the pronunciation; it will help in your understanding because it will help with your retention. It will help with your recognition, and so and this is generally something that is recommended when you're learning a language. That something that can help you in picking up the language is trying to practice and get a hang of the sounds of the language. In the Arabic language, alhamdulillah, we're blessed that we have a very well developed science of tajweed that can also help you with that. So practicing the speaking, and here in this case with this book, practicing producing or reading the full sentences will help you get the hang of producing full sentences. And as your vocabulary grows, then when you're in a position where you're trying to speak, you'll be better able to produce good sound, natural sounding sentences. And so all of that will also help you with your Arabic learning. In any case, that brings us to a close. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Until our next session on Protips for Learning Arabic.